guys, welcome to Force and Motion and Simple Machines, lesson number 2, different kinds of net force. Last class we learned what is a force. Well, a force is a push or pull on an object, causing it to move, stop, or change direction. We also learned that an object will stay at rest until a force, or push or pull, sets it in motion. We also talked about motion, and that motion is changing or moving the location of an object from one place to another. And that motion is an effect of a force, which means motion happens because of a force. Just like how if we pushed an applied force to this side of the box, it would move forward. Today, we're learning how to identify different kinds of force that make up net force. You'll be able to label the different kinds of force that make up net force by the end of today. Some important vocabulary words that you need to know today are friction, which is a force that slows down an object when it rubs against another object, and gravity. Gravity is the natural force that pulls objects toward the earth. Let's talk some more about this. Well, there's lots of different kinds of force. And here they all are on a picture. Let me read them to you. We've got friction force, gravity force, applied force, drag force, spring force, magnetic force, tension force, and buoyant force. Today, we're going to be focusing on friction force, gravity force, spring force, and magnetic force. Gravity is a pulling force. In fact, gravity is the pulling force that keeps everything on Earth. It's the reason why you're standing or sitting where you are on the Earth today. Gravity is the reason we do not float in the air. We're pulled to the ground. The bigger an object is, the stronger pull gravity has on it. This is why we feel the pulling effects of gravity so strongly on Earth, because the Earth is so huge. If you were to stand up right now and jump up and down, you would find that you don't just float up into the air, but that gravity pulls you back to the ground. That's the force of gravity. Another kind of force is friction. Friction is an opposing force on the motion of an object. This means it works against the motion of an object and forces it to slow or stop down. Here we see a pushing force on this box. Well, it's moving forward, the motion is forward, but the ground underneath the box is creating friction against the box. And the friction is actually pushing the opposite direction that we are on this side of the box, which slows down the motion of the box. The amount of texture something has determines the amount of friction that will be produced when motion goes across it. Here's an example. When we see this guy crossing over the ice, we see there's very little friction as he walks. That's because ice has a smooth surface. When we walk across it, there is very little friction that opposes our forward motion. So when our foot goes across the ground, there's not much friction coming against the foot on the ground, which causes the surface of the ice to be slippery and the man to fall, because there's not enough friction to oppose his forward motion. So he goes slipping and sliding. The motion just carries him completely forward off of the ground. It's too much motion. Okay, but the same goes if there's a lot of friction, okay? The texture will, again, determine the amount of friction that will be produced when motion goes across it. So here's an example of when there's a lot of friction. Rocks have a rough and bumpy surface. When you skateboard over rocks, grass, or soil, the motion of your skateboard will slow down because there will be more friction opposing your motion. Here are some other real life examples of friction. When you walk, the ground opposes your foot. It goes the opposite direction of the forward motion of your foot. It keeps you from slipping and sliding. Another example is you rubbing your hands together. There's friction in that. Another kind is drag, which is a kind of friction that happens when we move through the air. And then the forces acting when riding a bicycle. So the air resistance. We see that there's air resistance here, but the friction is against the tires' motion on the ground. Another kind of force is spring force. Spring force is a force applied to a spring that results in the motion of the spring stretching. The more the spring is pulled, the more it will stretch. This stretching motion is what spring force is. Another kind of force is magnetic force. Magnetism is a force in which one material exerts an attractive or repulsive force on certain other materials. Here we see that the attraction is the pulling force between the two different poles, so south is being attracted to the north, and the repulsion is the force that occurs when the two of the same poles push away from each other. So south and north attract, and north and north are repulsed. They repel each other. When more than one force acts on an object at one time, then all of these forces together are called net force. So here we see there's a lot of different forces acting on this guy riding his bike. He's got gravity pulling him down to the earth. He has air resistance pushing against his forward motion. And then there's friction of the bike tires against the ground, pushing against his motion. All of these forces together are net force. Now that we talked about all the different kinds of forces that make up net force, it's your turn. You need to label the different kinds of forces that make up net force by dragging these boxes to the correct square to show what kind of force is being shown there. After that, you got to tell me the definition, the correct definition of each kind of force. And finally, on this sticky note, tell me as many kinds of forces as you can and write it in the box. All right, go ahead and give that a try now.